back for the second of 3 sessions. Jennings has published this book, An Anti-Colonial History of This Place, and the slides that you saw last week are in this book. And the explanations are really powerful. I bought it right away from Mary when she showed it to me some months ago, bought it for Claire, my wife. And so I suggest that you all talk to Mary if you'd like to purchase a book. So we'll have these available this week and next. So as I said last week, there's a saying that the Lord loves the truth, and we continue with this truth-telling in our community as we move forward with this session. So please welcome Jennings back to St. Anthony Park Lutheran Church.
Hello, thank you for having me. I assume that if the microphone isn't close enough, Andy Sackrider will appear to remove the microphone and potentially also my head. Okay. So this is the second presentation. This one's going to be a lot less fun because we're talking about boarding schools. So from the beginning, throughout colonization, there was always an integral aspect of proselytism. When Columbus arrived, he arrived with a flag and a cross. The cross, the Cruz de la Para, is now in Cuba still. And even in the arrival of settler colonists in what is now North America, John Winthrop, who most famously authored the City on the Hill, wrote about how the smallpox was divinely ordained to have cleared the natives from the land and preserved their title to the land. This was in 1634. And obviously the idea of divine ordination of that white settlers were anointed to take the rest of the land, the rest of North America, was a key factor in Manifest Destiny. I don't love that I had to use this painting twice, but now that I've already had to use it twice, I'm going to see if I can't use it a third time next week, because comedy comes in threes, I guess. So in this much larger version of the painting, you can see Providence heading westward. Behind her follows Progress, the trains, the farms, I do have a laser pointer this week. Excellent. The tilling, the settlers, the covered wagons, and before her flees the Indians. There's also, interestingly, quite a lot of scholarly debate about what this book that she's holding is, because John Gast, the illustrator, did not title it clearly enough for historians to be able to read it. So, fun aside. It's going to be one of many fun asides in today's presentation, just as last week's. Completely unrelated, let's talk about definitions of genocide. Don't worry, it'll all tie back in. So genocide was defined in 1948 by the United Nations, and the definition was publicly declared in 1951. I will now take 3 guesses when the U.S. ratified this definition of genocide. They have done it already, so a second guess. 1988 is when the U.S. formally recognized this definition of genocide, but in spite of that, there is still a lot of pushback to recognizing the founding of the U.S. and the treatment of the indigenous populations as a genocide. So the definition that the UN laid out is long, but there are 2 distinct elements. There is a mental element, the intent to destroy in whole or in part a nation, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such. So to define an identity out of existence. And a physical element, which includes the following 5 acts. Killing, serious bodily harm, inflicting conditions of life calculated to bring about destruction, imposing measures intended to prevent births, and forcibly transferring children of one group to another group. I bolded E because we're talking about boarding schools. So religious boarding schools religious schools for the quote-unquote benefit and betterment of the indigenous populations have existed in some form since shortly after John Winthrop's bit about smallpox. At that time, they were largely mission schools, so the attempt was to get Indians to willingly convert or forcibly convert and then willingly move to particular settlements where there would be they would be built around the idea of the church. Brotherton in Michigan is one example. There are also a number earlier on the East Coast. But by 1819, westward expansion was pretty much beginning, and Congress authored an act, the Civilization Fund Act of 1819, which appropriated $10,000, today more than $200,000, to the War Department, because remember, Indians were handled by the War Department until the 1850s, to essentially work as grants, be given as grants to individuals who were already engaged in educating Indians, which at this point meant Catholic and Protestant missions. And this started a very interesting arms race between Catholic and Protestant denominational schools who wanted to educate the most Indians and therefore get the most funding from the government. And it also intersected, interestingly, with who was in charge of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. There was a lot of philanthropy and political dealing to get someone sympathetic to your denomination in charge of the BIA to give you more money to do more education. It was phased out in the 1890s because Congress went, oh wait, we have a whole First Amendment thing. We shouldn't be giving churches money. Oh well. And by that time in the 1890s, the model of education had changed significantly. By 1890, the frontier had closed, which is a term technically defined by the Census Bureau as there were not tracts of land in the continental U.S. without settlers living on them. In the 1870s, moving forward, this meant also that the government outlook towards Indians was changing. Until the 1870s, again, in part because of the housing of Indian Affairs in the War Department, these were enemy nations to be destroyed or made subservient to the United States. The term domestic dependent nation was invented by the Supreme Court to define the relationship between indigenous nations and the United States government, effectively saying you are foreign nations, but you are not foreign independent nations. You are domestic, you are locally located dependent nations, a term that then Supreme Court Justice John Marshall fully invented, because that's how most of Indian law gets written. Somebody makes something up, and then everyone has to pretend it's a real thing. This map shows all of the reservations in 1890. And certainly by the 1890s, but beginning in the 1870s, the mentality began to shift. Advocating for war and extermination became something of a faux pas. You didn't want to say it. Instead, you wanted to couch it in rhetoric of, here's how we can assimilate them. Here's how we can make them not themselves, and integrate them into the United States, a process that, despite more pleasant language, was no less violent, as we will see. This was also the era of a lot of Friends of the Indians organizations advocating for things like evangelism and education on reservations. This is what one of the alleged Friends of the Indians said. Lyman Abbott, a Congregationalist minister, said, "It is sometimes said that the Indians occupied this country and that we took it away from them, that the country belonged to them. This is not true. Indians did not occupy this land. A people do not occupy a country simply because they roam over it." And this ties back into last week's discussion with the maps, because maps provide legitimacy. If you don't put someone's borders on a map that you were using, you have rhetorically undermined their claim to the land. So by omitting indigenous nations from maps, you can further that notion, which remains quite strong to this day, that Indians did not own the land, they did not occupy the land, they just simply happened to be here and were using it until colonists arrived. In 1881, the Bureau of Indian Affairs issued a report, and in the section about education, they outlined a problem. The problem was that the Indians were not dying out, quote, under the light and contact of civilization, as had been generally supposed. The Indian population in 1881 was in fact increasing, and the Bureau of Indian Affairs could not abide by this because, again, the whole point was they didn't want there to be any more Indians, but you couldn't outright advocate murder because after a series of very public massacres, most notably the Sand Creek Massacre, the decade before, the American public as a whole didn't like witnessing and learning about essentially the nitty-gritty of genocide. You wanted that to be obscured. You didn't want to read about it in the papers. You didn't want to see photographs because that made it too real and reminded you of what was actually happening. The report continued, the Indian is evidently destined to live as long as the white race until he becomes absorbed or assimilated within his pale brethren. And additionally, they continue, we here no longer advocated among civilized men the theory of extermination, a theory that would disgrace the wildest savage. We can't just kill them anymore. That's bad optics. We have to do something else. The report continued talking about the practice of establishing day schools on reservations. Day schools were like any other school. You would send your children for the day and then they would come home at night. Many of these in this era were still run by religious orders. A few were run directly by the government, but at this point it was still largely religious orders. And the report says that these aren't great. They have scanty and imperfect appointments, present a cheerless aspect within and without, and are better calculated to repress than to stimulate thirst for knowledge in the minds of the young. Keep this critique in mind, it'll come up later. The report advocated for instead the creation of industrial schools or boarding schools. And continue, I cut that part out, but continue to mention one Colonel Richard Henry Pratt and his innovative exploration into industrial boarding schools. The difference being, the boarding school, you don't send the children home at the end of the day. They live there. And remember what the point 5 in the genocide definitions was. So Colonel Richard Henry Pratt, man who invented the term racism, interestingly enough, and used it without any sense of irony. In a speech advocating for the strength of his educational model, he says, a great general has said that the only good Indian is a dead one. In a sense, I agree with the sentiment, but only in this, that all the Indian there is in the race should be dead. Kill the Indian in him and save the man. So this gets at and this became the presiding educational notion of, in order to save these people, you have to destroy everything about them. You have to preserve their fundamental humanity by removing them from their culture and extirpating every instance of culture. In the original speech, he continues that this model is not just to be applied to Indians, it can also be applied to blacks, he did not use that word, quote, white trash, unquote, and the Irish. And this was his brainchild, Carlisle Indian School, which after the 1881 report got granted a lot of money. It was the site of a former army barracks, And Pratt's initial experience with education began when he was watching prisoners of war. He felt that he could teach them English and dress them in military uniforms, and that they would thrive under this circumstance. And he did, in fact, teach them English and dress them in military uniforms. And he said, success. Let's do this with children now. And they let him, because you could do anything in the 1800s. One of the most famous images to come out of Carlisle was that of Tom Torlino. The one on the left shows him in 1882, and the one on the right shows him in 1885. Pratt was a highly skilled propagandist. He created and hired for the creation a lot of these images of Indian boarding schools that circulate to make it seem like it was working. Interestingly, it's, and perhaps unsurprisingly, it's not as straightforward as here's a before and after image. There were different photographic techniques used with the layering of green filters in 1882 and then taking them away in 1885 to make Tom Torlino look darker in the before photo and lighter in the after photo. Pratt wanted to show that his process of assimilation could not just assimilate someone, but make them seem whiter, make them physically more like the dominant culture. After leaving Carlisle Indian School, Tom Torlino returned to the Navajo Reservation in Arizona and worked as a document translator for Chief Manuelito, which was not Pratt's goal in educating him or anyone else. The goal was that they would leave the school and then immediately integrate within white society. To that end, he even, in the summers when the school was not operational, placed them in white families, to live with white families nearby, to live and work as domestic servants over the summer until they returned to school, where they worked as domestic servants at the school, because the Carlisle Indian School was rife with every conceivable form of abuse, and what a later government report would outline as child labor. More than 10,000 children were forced to attend Carlisle School. You can see in the admission forms, you have the child's name, and then you have what the child's name was changed to. Children from more than 140 nations were forced to come to Carlisle. They were instructed only in English, told only to speak English, punished for speaking their own languages. Their hair was cut, their clothes were taken away. An incredibly traumatic process. Many of them died at the school. Many of them suffered abuses at the school. Those that did survive to return home often found themselves unable to communicate with their families because of the language barrier that had been imposed. People would hide their children to not be taken away by government agents. People would try to follow their children to the school and camp out on the school grounds to be closer to their children. In the Hopi Reservation in the Southwest, the 17 tribal policemen who were members of the tribe who were tasked with taking children for boarding schools resigned instead and were imprisoned in Alcatraz Island for their refusal to cooperate. Of the children who were sent to Carlisle, more than 2% were killed in the process of their quote-unquote education. The Carlisle model was very successful, in part because of Pratt's propaganda. I say successful in that it became very popular. More than 350 total schools in the Carlisle model were created across the country. I, in this presentation, decided not to get into the history of residential schools in Canada because it's slightly different Mandatory attendance was slightly different. It operated until from the 1880s until 1947, and then day schools on reservations continued. The Canadian boarding school system is what sort of recently catalyzed this in the public consciousness because of the uncovery of a number of mass graves to date, totaling more than 6,000 children found across Canada. But because of, and the Canadian system was also modeled after the successes of Carlisle. During this era, more than 75% of Indian children attended boarding schools. Carlisle was in Pennsylvania, right here. It was intentionally located to be as far away from most reservations as possible. Children were sent from what was then the Alaska Territory to attend Carlisle. The point of Carlisle as a model and residential boarding schools was not just cultural separation, but also intense physical separation from family and land and culture. Because the goal was, if you separate children from their culture, the culture will die. And when the culture dies, the government can take the rest of the land. During the boarding school era, the amount of reservation land was reduced by more than 2/3. In 1900, Carlisle had been operational for 19 years or so. 20,000 children were forced to attend boarding schools. 25 years later, that number had tripled to more than 60,000. The boarding school model itself outlived Carlisle as an institution because during World War I, the government decided that they wanted it back to train soldiers. So the Carlisle School itself closed in 1917, but the model that it sparked continued. Of the 350 schools, about 150 were administered directly by the government, and the remaining 200 were similarly religious schools. In 1928, there was a report authored and sent to the Secretary of the Interior, because remember, by now Indians are handled on the interior. The problem of Indian administration. I think it's funny to me personally that the Secretary of the Interior was named Hubert Work. I think it would be funnier if he was Labor Secretary, but that's just me. Excerpts from the 1928 report. Survey staff finds itself obliged to say frankly and unequivocally that provisions for the care of the Indian children in boarding schools are grossly inadequate. The diet is deficient in quantity, quality, and variety. The term child labor is used advisedly. The labor of children as carried out in Indian boarding schools would, it is believed, constitute a violation of child labor laws in most states. The discipline of boarding schools is restrictive rather than developmental. Nearly every boarding school visited furnished disquieting illustrations of the failure to understand the underlying principles of human behavior. Exactly what you want to hear about a school. And remember, this was the better solution. Day schools didn't work because of their failure to stimulate intellectual vigor. But you know what stimulates intellectual vigor? Murder. And the public outcry about the boarding schools and the government recognition that maybe abusing children is bad, maybe, not definitely, just maybe, led to a general shuttering of boarding schools. They were, I didn't put in a slide for this, they were replaced largely by day schools on reservations, the same model that had been abandoned before, and day schools were, in a sense, more positive because it allowed, one, you can go home at the end of the day, and also it allowed nominally more control from the tribe over what was happening at the school. They were still not great. They were still pointedly not great, but they were comparatively better. And this gets back to the, like we talked about last time, the pendulum swing of Indian history. It's not like good and bad. It's like worse and slightly better, worse and less worse. And this was the swing towards less worse. But as always, it's going to swing back towards worse. And now we get into the adoption era, which began in 1958. The Indian Adoption Project as a federal program ran until 1967. And then with a slightly more international focus, it continued from a subsequent organization that eventually took over for its purpose, ran from 1966 until the early 70s. The Indian Adoption Program, that's my next slide, oh yeah, not yet, was favored by the government for a couple reasons. It was cheaper than running a boarding school. Now, with adoption, the financial burden is on the people who do the adoption. It is not on the government. And for the government, that is a good thing. Additionally, you are still taking children. You are still undermining the future of a nation and culture by removing their children. Genocide's definitions 2 and 5, or sorry, B and E. This also coincided with termination policies, which was a broader idea that reservations have worked great. They've worked so well that you've demonstrated that you can be a part of white society. So we're going to take the reservation now. You don't need that. Termination was eventually, after some pushback, again, the pendulum swung the other way. A number of the tribes that had been terminated were reinstated, but with significant loss of land, which is, again, what the government wants, the land. Two key examples are the Menominee Reservation ran a very successful sawmill, and to the point where it outcompeted other sawmills in Wisconsin. The government went, great, you're so successful. You don't need to hold your sawmill in trust anymore. We can take it and sell it to the Weyerhaeuser Corporation. So they did. Similarly, the 3 affiliated tribes in North Dakota were terminated in part because the government wanted to flood the reservation to build a dam. And then they did. They flooded the reservation and built the dam. And then they named it the Sacagawea Dam. Because, as Billy Collins said, in America, we name things after the people we had to chase away to put there. And coinciding with the adoption program was a media campaign, another propaganda campaign, to sell white families on the adoption of Indian children. There were a lot of very heartwarming stories about unwanted Indian orphans finding homes that really tugged the heartstrings of the American people as a whole. The problem was, most of these children were not orphans. They were in fact taken from their parents, often forcibly. Again, out of this era, you get stories of parents telling their children to hide when social workers come. There were phrases broadly used like parents unfit by social workers to justify the theft of children, and by the 1960s, 1 in 4 Indian children were living apart from their parents, either having been adopted or in foster care. The initial government program itself only placed about 500 children. And of those 500 children, 95% went to white families. But much like the Carlisle School, the trend it sparked outlived the program itself. This became a model for state services as well as for private adoption agencies. And in Minnesota, one of the largest private adoption agencies was the Lutheran Children's Friends Society. Again, interesting use of the word friends. The Lutheran Children's Friends Society was a synod organization and was in, I want to say, the 90s, folded into Lutheran Social Services. In 1978, like we talked about last time, except I got the date wrong last time, was the passage of the Indian Child Welfare Act, which, among other things, required states to provide resources to tribes to prevent the breakup of nuclear families, and in instances where removal was deemed necessary, adoption priority would be given to first the extended family. Oh, I cut off my sentence. Oh well. First the extended family, and then any other Indian family before being considered outside. Today, in spite of programs like ICWA, Native children are still 4 times more likely to be placed into foster care than white children, even in the presence of similar issues. And the very successful propaganda campaign that sparked interest in adoption of Native children continues to be successful. Today, the demand for adoption of Native children exceeds the availability of Native children for adoption by a factor of 100 to 1. And ICWA itself has increasingly come under threat in part because of bad faith criticism that it is based on race. It is not a race-based program, it is a nationality-based program. You are trying to destroy a culture and nationality, not a race. It is in the interest of the US power structure to make Indianness a race, but it is not. It is a series of political identities. And threats to ICWA are largely financed by people like the Koch brothers. Here's a nice graphic. Because just as it always was, taking the children is a way to eventually undermine sovereignty. By taking ICWA, you can undermine the family, so you can undermine other rights given to Native people, so that fundamentally the last domino to fall is sovereignty. By taking the children, you can undermine the sovereignty and the future of the nation, and then you can get the land, and you can get all the natural resources that are on the land, because reservation land is disproportionately wealthy in natural resources that it is in the interest of certain figures to try and get. Yeah, so like I said, this one is a lot more depressing than last week's. And there's my presentation. I can take questions now if you have any, but there's that. ICWA is the Indian Child Welfare Act. Yeah, and it's been the subject of recently attempts to undermine it. I believe there currently, or is in the next session, going to be a Supreme Court case that consolidates 3 cases around ICWA about white families who were unable to complete adoption of Indian children because of intervention by the tribes or ICWA. And this is going to be fun, quote unquote, because of the fact that all Indian law is made up as you go along. There's no constitution against which to measure Indian law, because it is invented whole cloth by whatever judge is making the ruling. And in the case of the current Supreme Court, this does not bode well for what judges will be making the ruling. And it further does not bode well for those judges' understanding of things like tribal sovereignty. More answer than you were probably wanting, but here we are. Don't everybody talk at once.
But
Yeah, probably, like you said, probably want to spend less time in Pratt, Kansas. But yes, it is interesting, like we talked about last week, what gets commemorated through names and who gets the honor of having a place named after you and how that place ties to your legacy, places like Pike Island. Pastor Daniel, do you want to hand out the, yeah, do you want to talk about that? Here you go.
Before I continue, can we please acknowledge Jennings' second session? And thank you so much. So what is being handed out now, I talked to Jennings before his session, and I thought it would be good for those of you who don't know about it to see the ELCA's declaration to First Nations communities in the country. So those of you, has anyone ever gone to an ELCA churchwide assembly here? Mark and, yeah. So as far as I know, the churchwide assembly is the highest governing authority in our church. When a vote happens at churchwide, it's the highest decision-making body. And in 2016, this declaration was voted on by the churchwide assembly. And you'll see it has three parts. There's a declaration, then there's a confession, and then there's a pledge. And so how many of you knew about this declaration? Just raise your hand if you knew. It's no problem. Nobody's in trouble if you didn't. Yeah. So, so very few of us in this room knew, right? If you look through the social statements and declarations of the ELCA, you'll find all kinds of confessions there, actually. There's confessions about what the Lutherans did to the Mennonites. There's confessions about, racial justice and all sorts of things. And most of us kind of on the ground in our churches aren't aware of the reconciling work that has even been attempted. It's kind of what you said about who knows about this statement. It was made in 1988 about genocide. It took our church till 2016 to say anything about this, right? So I would direct you to that third page with the pledge, and you'll see there's a section there to the American Indian Alaska Native community in the U.S. We commit to better understanding the doctrine of discovery, identifying the ways in which it is still used to oppress Indigenous people, and how best to realize our church's repudiation of such a sinful ideology. Therefore, we commit to partnership with Native nations and with Native organizations that educate, support, and interpret the rights of Indigenous people, including the National Congress of American Indians and the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition. We commit to national and international advocacy through our ELCA Washington office, the Lutheran Office for World Community at the United Nations, as well as in state and local legislative bodies. We commit to learning about treaties and to engage our members in advocacy for treaty rights as they affect current issues of justice. I did not pull this out as a celebration of us. I didn't pull it out so that we could be proud, like, look, we created a declaration. I pulled it out because Jennings has offered his time and is calling us, our hearts, to be convicted. And I wonder what you're feeling right now as you imagine these children being torn out of the arms of their parents. I remember when I saw Schindler's List for the first time, and there's a horrible scene where they round up all those Jewish children and put them in a truck and take them away from their parents. And I remember I was filled with such rage. If I had had a gun, I would have shot all the Nazis there in that minute. And I wonder if we could see images of what our country did to these children and continues to do it through these policies, how would our hearts also be convicted, and what would we do to act to address it? And of course, we don't have the answer. I don't have the answer. But I do believe some of the answer starts with education, starts with someone like Jennings sharing his time and expertise with us. And I pray that we can move forward with this as we have another session with Jennings. And then after this, I think we'll meet again as an adult ed community on November 7th, and we're going to process this. We're not going to just, stop these sessions and move on to the next one. Let's talk about this, amen? And pray together and search our hearts for what ways we can get involved with our larger church's mission to restore and redress some of these crimes. So again, Jennings, thank you so much. We'll see you next week. What's next week's session on? I can't recall what.
Next week's session is, broadly speaking, Indigenous ecological concerns. So we're going to talk about wilderness and line 3, among other things.
Wilderness and pine tree. Wow, and I think line 6 is in there. Line 3 is in there. Yeah, okay, sorry. So there'll be some really powerful issues we'll discuss next week. So again, thank you. Thank you all for coming, and we'll look forward to seeing you next week. Thank Jennings one more time. And as I said, his book is available, so just speak to me or Mary about that.